couple of housekeeping notes. We now can finalize the exam dates, at least as far as the information that we all have. So as I mentioned last time, but now I can confirm, you will get to choose between Monday, May 4th or Tuesday, May 5th. Now I realize some of you can't go one of those days, but you, according to what you gave me, you can make it on the other. Again, you would be picking up the exam here in the law school at 9, and you'd have till 5 p.m. I'll go into far more detail. The class before the last class, the penultimate class, just in terms of both the procedure as well as what the exam is going to be like. We have that whole class dedicated to talking about the exam. If for whatever reason you're uneasy, anxious, unhappy, by all means feel free to ask me ahead of time, but no reason to be, at least as far as I can see. Okay, other piece of housekeeping. Assignment 2, you may or may not have started working on it. For those of you who submitted assignment 1 last week, I am going to try to get it back to you a week from today, so next Tuesday, so it'll be 2 days before assignment 2 is due. I realize that's not a lot of time, but it's a lot of grading for me, and I want to give them appropriate time so I can give you my comments. So I would strongly recommend that those of you who like to get things in early, for which I commend highly, hold off till after you get assignment 1 back in case there's some hint in there that you didn't realize that you might be able to learn from. Any questions?
So what was assignment 2?
Assignment 2 is due a week from Thursday. So you have a week and 2 days. Any other questions? Okay, so now we move into maybe my favorite section of the course, which also happens to be the most difficult, which isn't why I like it. I just find it very interesting, and that is legislative history. And this is one of my favorite classes with regard to legislative history because we get to see a cartoon, and what can be bad about a cartoon, right? What we will be doing today is going over the concepts of legislative history. So I'm afraid it will be a cartoon and then some lecture. The point of the mostly lecture is to get across to you the concepts. If you understand what the process is and what the documents are and how they're abbreviated, believe it or not, abbreviation is like half the battle in understanding this. If you understand that, then you will be probably 3/4 to 99% the way there to understanding how to research legislative history. What I have done is prepared 2 handouts for you that are complementary. The key to legislative history research is the one you'll want to hang on to. It's also in our handouts link on the course website. This other are just, again, photocopies of pages, what's called a walkthrough, so you can look and see what these documents look like up close and personal at your desks as we walk through them. What I'm not going to focus on a great deal is where you find these actual documents, because honestly, that's part of what makes legislative history difficult, is that they're all over the place. And honestly, we could spend weeks trying to remember where they all are. I don't always remember where they all are. So I want you to focus on the concepts, what these documents are, why we care about them, what the process is, and don't worry about where exactly you'll find them. Basically, my advice to you is come ask a professional if you can't figure it out on your own after a couple of tries. And again, that's the other reason is because there are different databases to address this, and we'll be looking at one. You may or may not have access to that. And it's also going to look very different on Lexis than it will on Westlaw. There's not really much on Bloomberg. So again, it depends on where you wind up as to what you'll have access to. Okay. So enough of what the difficulties are. If this is so difficult, one fair question you will have. Oh, did Westlaw log me out? It did. Sorry about this. Let me log right. One fair question you will have is, why are we bothering if this is so difficult and it's so hard to find all of these? And one of the answers actually is in a case I'm going to pull up, but the other answer actually Justin provided for me a couple of classes ago where he had a question for his internship. I hope you don't mind mentioning this, it's a little late. Question with an internship regarding finding the legislative history of a particular language in a particular code section of the Internal Revenue Code. And if I'm summarizing correctly, we were trying to track down a committee report to see if the committee discussed a particular phrase in the code section to give it more, to explain why they chose the particular language they chose. Is that a fair? I don't want to put words in your mouth. And that is basically a long way of describing what the phrase legislative intent means. What did the legislature, we're talking about Congress now, but you could also be talking about a state legislature. What did the legislature intend by the language they chose, that very controlled vocabulary that they chose in whatever legislation they enacted? So what I'm showing you now here, and I'm going to scroll down to a highlighted, can you see it? It actually comes out. This is a New York case that's in the highest court, the Court of Appeals. And in the language of the decision, it has to do with the statute of limitations. And in the language of the decision, the judge, in I think it's his opinion, writes that the legislature replaced 2-year limitations in this particular act. The revisers noted that the statute was added on the suggestion malpractice, and it explains why it's maybe based on contract. And so basically what they are doing is they're going back to this report that was prepared by this legislative committee. Actually, this is considering when they were revising the CPLR back in the 60s. And they went back to the committee that was considering revising the CPLR and looked at the committee legislative report. So this, you can see how legislative intent, going back to the documents that were prepared in the course of the legislation, were used successfully in a case. I like to think a enterprising junior associate, because it's junior associates that get assigned legislative history research in law firms, thought, ooh, I'm going to check the legislative history, and they very diligently, and took a lot of time because it takes time to go through all these documents, went through and actually found in this legislative report language addressing the in the report found a description addressing the particular language that was at issue in the case having to do with the statute of limitations. So that essentially is the why of legislative history. You want to find out what the language might mean. Now I have to tell you this, if I'm right in this enterprising young associate went and did this, this is not something that you'll find yourself doing frequently. Probably there are going to be a number of you, if not the majority of you, that don't ever do this, but you don't know if it's going to be you or not, and actually it's already been Justin, so I'm somewhat justified in that. It does happen. One thing you want to be careful about with legislative intent arguments, in other words, what you're doing with legislative history research is you're going back to the documents that the legislature produced as they were considering whether or not to pass this legislation. Obviously the legislation got passed because it's in the code and that's the language you're wondering about. So what you need to be careful about, at least with regard to, well, what you need to be careful about is this concept of going back to these documents isn't universally accepted. I'm going to pull up a case here, if you'll bear with me. 507 US 511. This is a Supreme Court case. And what's up here up top is actually a highlight. I'm going to scroll down to the place in the decision. This is actually Justice Scalia's dissent. Justice Scalia is renowned for his disdain, and that's putting it mildly, for legislative intent arguments. And you can send, he writes wonderfully well, if a little acerbically, so he writes about the greatest defect of legislative history is its illegitimacy. So pretty much I don't have to go any further than that to let you know, if you find yourself in front of the Supreme Court, don't count on Justice Scalia's support if you're making a legislative intent, any argument based on the legislative intent. However, he's in the dissent in this case, so obviously the arguments had some sway, and maybe the legislative intent arguments in this particular case had a great deal of sway with the majority of the justices. So it's not to say don't make these arguments, otherwise I wouldn't be here telling you how to do it. But just be aware that it's not universally accepted. Okay, so that is the why and the what to be careful of in terms of why we're diving into this more difficult area of research. Okay, so what are the keys? And the keys basically, I hope, are straightforward, excuse me, on the handout. So understanding the legislative process. I mean, you probably, again, learned this back in 9th grade or whenever it was, but now what you want to focus on is what are the documents produced, because that's what you're researching in legislative history. So that's 1 and 2 are kind of this quite related. So Roman numeral 2, understand the documents produced in this process in each step and recognize their abbreviations. Again, I mentioned that earlier, because what's going to happen is you're going to see these abbreviations, H and R's and S's and RPTs and all sorts of fun stuff. And a lot of people get themselves confused because they think HR means House Report, which kind of makes sense, right? HR, but it doesn't. And HR abbreviation is actually a bill. We'll go through that in more detail in the handout in just a little while. So basically I'm going to focus today on the concepts in terms of understanding Roman numerals 1 and 2. Roman numeral 3, know a couple of good sources. Again, it's going to be different depending on where you are. The source coverage is even different within the same database. Here at Hofstra, we subscribe to one portion of a database called Congressional. We don't subscribe to another portion. If you went to a different law school, they might subscribe to another portion. So it's not even consistent within the same database. That's just how the vendors market and make money. They sell us portions of the database, full text in chunks. So again, don't worry about where am I going to find this in full text. It might take some doing. The document that Justin and I were trying to track down took some doing, and I ultimately, you could find it online, but I found it actually somewhat difficult to read. We ultimately found it in an old-fashioned set called the serial set. Again, don't worry so much about that. Worry about understanding the process. And part of using those couple of good sources, whatever they wind up being, and at least know of a couple, so maybe you don't know that, oh, I can find this particular document in this particular source, but know, okay, if I can access ProQuest Congressional, that's pretty good. Congress.gov, free website, also pretty good. We'll be going into more detail. So know a couple of sources and know how to find that all-important public law number. We went into great detail the last few classes, and I kept on asking you, what's the public law number? What's the public law number? You probably were getting a little bored with it by the end, but the reason is, first, to understand the difference between public law and the code, which we went into great detail on, but also to get the public law number, because that is the basis for doing any legislative history research in just about any source. So if you can find that all-important public law number, you're a good 25 to 30% the way there. Okay, any questions? So one way I have found to help understand the legislative process is indeed a cartoon. You may have seen this before. This has now made it, this has been on this. There have been send-offs on SNL and Jon Stewart. I think maybe Colbert. I don't know if he did one of this particular. But in its original, it actually does a really good job of explaining the process. So let's start with a cartoon.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be. Oh, I hope and pray that they will. But today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be, oh, how I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so believe it or not, as we go through, we're going to refer back, and our friend Bill, we'll call him Bill, actually refer to many of the documents that we're going to be looking at. Okay, actually I'm going to turn my light back on so I can see. So turning to page 2 of the Key Concepts handout, what you see on top is a summary of Roman numerals 1 and 2, understanding the legislative process, what I like to call the executive summary. And rather than summarizing the process, what I'm summarizing are the documents produced in each step of the process. So, of course, we start out with our bill to have stop signs at railroad crossings, I think is what it was. And so what I recommend you do is have the two handouts open simultaneously. So have the key concepts, and then you can take a look on the other side what the documents actually look like. So on the fatter handout on page 1, basically this is a visual representation of the process that our bill went through. First going through the House, then going through the Senate. Obviously, you can start in the Senate as well. So this is for those of you who like pictorial representations rather than text. Personally, to me, there are too many lines going in too many directions, so this doesn't make sense for me, but if it does for you, great. Getting to a little bit about bills, again, this is getting into a little bit of detail, but worth knowing just so you can see the terminology. On page 2, there are different versions of a bill, depending on, because of course bills can be amended. So we've got the introduced bill, and then you can see reported, engrossed, and then finally enrolled is when it's finally passed both houses and then is sent to the president. Again, I wouldn't worry about the terminology too much other than to just recognize when you see engrossed and enrolled, no, that has to do with the bill, and that's probably enough. Okay, so let's see what one of these look like. A cute little cartoon character, but inside the cute little cartoon character on page 3 is what you see here is the first page of a bill, which actually hopefully reminds you of a public law, because obviously the bill ultimately, if it does get passed and signed, becomes a public law, as he hopes, as our friend Bill hopes and prays. And again, as I mentioned before, understanding the abbreviations is half the battle, or at least a third of the battle. Bills are abbreviated, and you can see on page 2 of the key concepts. So bill is it's abbreviated either as HR, So when you see HR, it's not a report, it's House of Representatives bill, or S for Senate, which hopefully is less confusing. Okay, so turning the page of the examples handout, what I call the walkthrough, you'll see the table of contents on page 4 of the bill. Again, looks kind of like what we've been looking at our public law. And what we're looking at is actually a bill that amends ERISA, just to keep with our theme of ERISA. So this is actually the Bipartisan Patient Protection Act is what this was called. And this was back in the 107th Congress. So turning the page to page 5, what we see now is the next step in the process. So if you look at our executive summary, we start with a bill, and then the next step in the process is actually the bill getting referred to committee. Remember, our little friend Bill was in front of that door while there were all sorts of arguing congressmen, and there was lots of noise. Theoretically, behind that door, the committee, or sometimes subcommittee, because committee can cover a fairly broad range of topics, so it might go to a more specialized subcommittee. A subcommittee will hold hearings. That's what's going on behind that closed door. And as you can see on page 5, the example of a hearing, or at least the first page of a hearing, turns out our bill went to the subcommittee on health, which was part of the Committee on Ways and Means in the House of Representatives. Hearings are abbreviated a whole bunch of different ways. You can see on the example SHRG. Sometimes they don't get much of an abbreviation at all. It's just given the whole long name, hearing before the Subcommittee on Health or the Committee Ways and Means on a particular date. And what happens in the hearings, of course, a couple of things happens in the hearings. Let's turn the page to page 6 on the examples walkthrough handout. Not only do the congressmen debate amongst themselves, but they invite witnesses to testify before them so that they can get a sense from people interested, from experts, those who are knowledgeable. And you can see on page 6, as part of the text of the hearing, we have the witnesses on top. So these are the groups, or it could be individuals who come to actually appear before the hearing, before the committee. And there may also be written submissions. Experts, interested groups can send in their opinions and thoughts on the merits or lack of merit of the particular proposed bill. So you can see the submissions for the record from the American Psychological Association, National Council on Disability, on page 6. Turning on page 7, the hearing will include the text of those written submissions, but it will also have the written transcript of the oral testimony by whatever witnesses are invited to testify. So on page 7, you can see the beginning. Chairwoman Johnson invites Mr. Stark to sit down and say whatever it is Mr. Stark is going to say. And it looks kind of like a transcript or a play, if you're reading a play and one person says one thing and the next person says whatever they're going to say. So that's hearings. Hearings probably are not something you'll be looking at unless you really have to what's called boil the ocean for a particular research project, because hearings are what interested parties are going to say. So that's not really going to tell you why the language in the code in the section is what it is. But if you really need to look at every possible alternative, you might find yourself looking at hearings. Again, I would say that's fairly infrequent. Turning to page 8, we're looking at a committee print. Now, I don't even have committee print listed in our executive summary because committee prints are not typically produced in the course of legislation. A committee print is something requested by the committee of an expert body, sometimes the Congressional Research Service, sometimes an outside body, when there's a particularly complex, sometimes scientific, economic, math-based, for those of us who are math-challenged, area. So here's an example of a print. This actually this print didn't go with our particular amendment to ERISA. This is an example from another piece of legislation on the Committee on Finance, but I wanted you to see what a print looks like. See the abbreviation, I think is kind of straightforward. PRT, PT, might just be spelled out. The word print isn't all that long. And again, S for Senate, H for House. And notice the numbering system. The numbering system for all these federal legislative documents starts with the Congress number. So whatever the Congress number is, 107, 110, again, we're in 114. That first number is just going to tell you what Congress it is, which if you look up on our little chart, you'll figure out what year it is. Or if you're lucky, the document you're looking at will tell you what year it is. So in this example, 2001. And then the next number is just the particular random number assigned to that particular document. So you can identify that document. And just to see an example of a committee print on page 9, it's very technical. So you see lots of numbers and ranges. This has to do with tax structures. So Justin, you may be interested. So again, very technical. So you usually will not see a print. But if you do see a print, it's worth looking at because this is the technical analysis that Congress might have relied upon. I should mention, by the way, we are talking about federal legislative history. Legislative history research exists in the states. We'll talk about that next time. But it's going to be far less detailed with far, far fewer documents. But if you understand the concept in the legislative process, then the main difference will be what the documents are called. So back here in the federal world. Now let's turn to a committee report. So let's looking at on the key concepts handout, item number 3. So the committee holds its hearings. It listens to all these experts. Maybe it asks for a print, probably, usually not. Then the committee has a vote. If you remember our little bill, he talked about, I hope they report on me favorably. That means that the committee votes to say, hey, yeah, we think this is a good idea, this particular piece of legislation. We are going to vote favorably. The committee is usually divided proportionally by party, so whatever the proportion is between Republicans and Democrats, in the overall Congress, it's divided that way in the committee typically. So if the committee votes yes, we think that this piece of legislation should move forward. Also, I should say in the committee is opportunity for lots and lots of amendments. But if it votes favorably in whatever version it's reached, with whatever amendments have been accepted or rejected, it votes yes, it reports favorably and issues a committee report. And again, you want to be very cognizant of the abbreviations. It's not HR for report. HR is a bill. A House report would be HR and some other letters following it. Depends. REP, RPT, use your imagination on how the word report would be shortened. There's really no consistent abbreviation. There's probably a blue book rule on it. I honestly don't know it. But you're going to see it all over the map. So if you see HR, it's a bill. If you say HR with letters following it, it's probably a House report. So Senate, a little more straightforward, again, less confusing. SRPT, SREP, spell out the whole world. I've never seen it SR. So it's usually SR and letters following. Okay, so that's the abbreviation. What does the report do? The report is probably, scratch the word probably. The report is the best place to start your legislative intent research. Sometimes the report will be the only place. A lot of times the report will be the only place you need to go for your legislative intent research. So you're going to spend some time with the report. Basically, the committee reports on the bill, and they basically tell you what happened in the course of consideration. So here we see the Committee on Education and Labor, who's referred this particular bill revised, and they give you a synopsis. Turning to page 11, which is a few pages later in the actual report, what you will see is a section-by-section analysis. And when Justin came to me with his question for finding this particular intent for this particular tax code section, we found the reports easily enough, and then what I was looking for was this section by section analysis. This is actually an example, and maybe this is just a function of personal preference, but I find with the reports, I was having a hard time with Justin finding this section by section analysis in the report. When I went to the actual good old-fashioned print, heavy, dust-covered volume, I found the report number. Again, reports are numbered the same way, Congress number and then whatever random number the report is signed. Now again, those random numbers each document signed is not the same as the public law number. It's just a random number for the report. So this particular report was 93, so 93rd Congress. We're back looking at ERISA. And 533, random number 533 for a House report. Has nothing to do with ERISA public law number. But back to my example, we were looking at this report, and we finally found it online, and we were scrolling up and down and Control F and all sorts of fun stuff, and I had a hard time finding the section by section analysis because it was just a PDF online. Opened up the book, flipped open the report, and within a couple of minutes, less seconds, I was in the section by section analysis. I'm happy to pass this around. This actually is the report we were looking at. I'll start over here. And I've got I think I've got the beginning of the report tab and then the section by section analysis, but you can kind of see. This report actually looks a little bit different, which is a good point to bring up. It's called a section by section analysis typically, as you can see on page 11 in this particular report that we're looking at for ERISA. Not always, sadly. In tax legislation, because I took a look at some other reports, sometimes rather than go section by section, they'll go group of sections by group of sections because it covers a particular area or concept of tax law, which was part of the reason for our problem. But again, flipping through the paper, I was able to figure that out and say, oh, all right, they're explaining this particular range of sections, this particular portion of this new tax law. Sometimes they'll call it purpose, which kind of obviously sounds like intent, so worth checking as well. But again, much of the time, it's called section by section analysis, and you can just kind of flip through after the beginning and sort of look at the section heading and say, oh, all right, it's not called section by section analysis, it's analysis of this particular area, or whatever language they use. So again, the reports are going to be mostly what you want to look for and find. In fact, from what I understand, that's what Justin was asked to find by the assigning, was it an attorney or, okay, so there's somebody who understood legislative history and understood, okay, if I want to understand what went on to develop the language in this section, I want to look at the committee reports. Usually, well, okay, depending on the legislation, there will frequently be more than one report. So you may have to look at more than one to get a sense, because different committees consider the legislation for their particular area. So this was the subcommittee on health, so they're interested in the health aspects of ERISA. ERISA also talks about pension. So whatever committee talks about pensions probably also issued a report. We'll actually be looking at a list of the reports from ERISA in a while, and you'll see that there's a good number of them. There's sometimes there'll only be one. Depending on the legislation, there may only be one, but just be aware you may have to look at more than one. Okay, any question on committee reports? Hopefully, if you can, a couple of key things you can remember, one of which, legislative intent, check committee report. You can kind of put that in red, bold, and remember that. That would be good. Okay, on page 12 is an example of what the section by section analysis looks like. So section 101, coverage, title would cover. You can kind of see it's no longer in statutory language, but it's more discussing prose language. Administrative pension would be required to publish each participant, so plan descriptions would be required to be published within 120 days. So it's just explaining what the section's supposed to do. So hence the section by section analysis, and hence the best source for legislative intent. Okay, on your key concepts handout, you'll see after reports, I mentioned committee documents. there's actually a document called Documents, which you gotta love. I mean, just to make things even more difficult. Won't run into them too much. You can see the description. They're very specialized, specific types of documents that you'd only be looking at, say, for treaties. So I wouldn't worry too much about those, but I didn't want to leave it out in case you did encounter something like an H-doc or an S-doc. You would know that that's what that is. Okay, let's move on to probably one of the more interesting publications in legislative history research, but again, one I don't think you're going to need to use very much for legislative intent, and that is the Congressional Record. The only reason I'm going to spend some amount of time on it is that you're going to encounter references to it, and again, you'll want to understand the concept of what this document is, what it does, and why you might eventually want to look at it. I tend to think this is looked at more by scholars and political science majors and politicians. And basically, remember, after our bill was reported favorably, he went dragged to you saw the whole House, and you heard the House voted, and you saw lots of yeses up top. Before the House voted, not just the committee, but the entire House of Representatives debated our bill. Those floor debates, in other words, the entire chamber floor, by chamber I mean House of Representatives or Senate, so the entire chamber debates the bill. That's actually what you see on C-SPAN. I don't know if any of you watch C-SPAN at all. I sure don't, but I've passed through the channel and seen representations of it, and that's what the either Congress people or Senate people get up in front of the microphone and say whatever it is they want to say and show their funky charts and all of that. That happens on the House floor and the Senate floor, and that's what gets recorded in the Congressional Record. So the main thing, the most important thing, and if this is all you remember about the Congressional Record, that's good. Debates in the particular floor, debates of Congress. So debates in the House, debates on the Senate floor, in the Congressional Record. So Congressional Record equals debates is kind of how I put it in my notes. And here's an example of the Congressional Record. Now, it's an interesting publication because it's a very complex publication. Don't worry about the complexity. I'm going to highlight a couple of things you'll want to know about, because if you see references to the Congressional Record, you'll see these particular references. First of all, it's now called the Congressional Record. In prior years, it had prior names. On page 13, you can see that in gory detail. Again, don't worry about the gory detail. Just know that there are other names for it for earlier versions. What you might want to be aware of is that there are actually a couple of versions of the Congressional Record. So on page 14 is an example of the Congressional Record from 1974 when ERISA was considered. So there are debates having to do with ERISA in this volume. And here's what bound volume looks like. So version number 1 is bound volume. So technically version number 2. And there's what it looks like in real life, and there's what it looks like in paper on page 14. And notice the page, this is the date, February 26 to March 6, pages 4153 to 5628. And turn to page 15, and here's what it looks like. It looks like if you were reading the transcript of a debate. In the middle column, I'm just pulling this up randomly. Ms. Holtzman says, "It's my understanding that this matter," and then Mr. Erlenborn, "Mr. Chairman, will the gentlewoman yield further?" I'm not going to read you the whole page, but you get the idea. It's, again, I think it reads like a play. You've got the name of the character, and then you've got whatever it is they say. So that's what the Congressional Record bound volume looks like. The other version is called the daily edition. What actually happens, and this still happens, the Congressional Record first comes out in the daily edition. So each day it has an edition. Surprise, surprise. Why you care? Because look on the bottom of page 16. The daily edition has a page number with a letter in it. So if you see the Congressional Record with a page number with a letter in it, you know you're looking at the daily edition. If you see a Congressional Record site without a letter in it, you're looking at the bound volume. The reason you care is if you have to track it down, you don't want to be looking for the daily edition site in the bound volume and vice versa. So that's the main thing, the other main thing you want to know about the congressional record. Again, most important, remember, this is where we find debates on the whole floor of the House or the whole floor of the Senate. If you remember that, great. Remember the page number thing, that's good too, but not quite as important. So just so you can see what it looks like in the daily edition, kind of the same as it looked like in the bound volume. All that happens is they take it out of the daily edition, they bind it in the bound volume, and they repaginate it. Why they do this is beyond me. But that's how they do it. So on page 17, you can see what the daily edition looks like in print on page 17. And again, it looks like a play with Mr. Solus and Mrs. McCarthy and all sorts of people having their say. Page 18, you'll notice a different letter. Instead of H, it's S. Obviously, House of Representatives versus Senate. So the pagination in the daily edition tells you which chamber you're in. And again, pretty much looks kind of interesting, I think, on page 19, if there are any political junkies amongst you. There's the E pages in the daily edition. E stands for extension of remarks. What Congress, well, House of Representatives and Senators can do is they can add to the congressional record after the day's debates whatever additional remarks they might want to, so it's in the official record. So they can say, as part of the record, I said, well, not really said, you kind of added it later in these extension of remarks. So the extension of remarks has an E page number. And then finally, there can be a D page number. D for Daily Digest. That's just a summary of what's in each daily edition. It's a good tool to find where in the daily edition you can find particular sections. It's kind of like a table of contents for the daily edition with an abstract attached. And you can see on page 20 what the daily edition looks like. And it's continued on page 21. Actually, I copied quite a few pages through 22. Okay, so again, congressional record, not that great for congressional intent, although you can go and see what a particular congressperson said, so that certainly could indicate that individual's intent, but it's not going to indicate overall Congress's intent, because even if two senators voted the same way, one could have had totally different intentions than the other. Again, probably more for historical, political science research purposes. Okay, any questions about the congressional record? So remember, our friend Bill was debated in the full chamber, the House chamber. They all voted yes, hooray, and remember he got dragged over to the Senate and the whole process started all over again. So started in the committee in the Senate, and they held hearings in the Senate. And then if the Senate voted favorably, the Senate committee, or committees more likely, issued reports. And again, reports where you'll find the congressional intent. Then our bill went to the full chamber of the Senate, where it got debated, and all those debates in the full chamber of the Senate, again, appear in the congressional record. If the Senate also votes yes, now remember, through this whole process, in the full chamber of the Senate, in the committees of the Senate, there could be amendments. Just as there could have been amendments in the House, in the committees, and in the full chamber of the House. If that happens in the House and happens in the Senate, these are 535 people with 535 different points of view. So those amendments are probably going to be different in each chamber, right? So that means the final version passed in the House could be very different than or somewhat different than the final version passed in the Senate. So which version do they send to the president? They meet in what's called a conference committee. So the House leadership appoints a bunch of people, the Senate leadership appoints a bunch of people, those bunches of people get together in a room, and they sit down and they hash out their differences. And assuming they can come to an agreement, which doesn't always happen, but assuming they can come to an agreement, they produce a conference report. A conference report is like a committee report. It's abbreviated like a committee report, and it sheds light on intent the way a committee report does. I would say it's not quite as good a resource for legislative intent because the conference will only discuss those sections and that language and those provisions in which there were differences in the House and Senate versions. If there were no differences, the conference report will not discuss it. So what you see on page 23 of the examples handout is an example of a conference report. And it tells you which bill they were considering. Sometimes the chambers will decide to really focus on the House bill, or maybe they'll focus on the Senate bill, or maybe they really will each just focus on their own bills and then get together. It can happen any which way. I wouldn't worry too much about it. You can see that what this conference report does, again, for ERISA, the conference came together. The House and Senate conferees agreed on which language from each version they were going to go with. And then in the conference report, they discussed those areas and why they chose what they chose. So turning to page 23, and this is where, it's an example where this is a committee report, but you won't see the language section by section analysis. You'll see reporting and disclosure. Basically, again, this is where you just have to flip or scroll if you're looking at the PDF until you see language that suggests, okay, they're now analyzing it section by section or portion by portion. So reporting and disclosure, you can see sections 101 through 111. So they don't discuss each section, but they discuss them as a group. So the House bill requires this, the Senate bill requires submission. The conference decided to substitute and adopts reporting format contained in both. So they're now saying they considered, and now they're doing both. So if you needed to figure out what the intent is between that language, you now know that they actually sort of mushed together both versions. And just turning to page 23B, in the conference report, actually, turns out they took a look at our good old section 514. Remember 514, anybody? Preemption? So under the substitute provisions are to supersede. So this kind of explains what they had in mind with regard to the preemption section 514. Will this elucidate anything for us, for our client? Doubtful. I don't think our particular issue revolves around any language within section 514. Well, actually section 1144, because remember 514 got changed a bunch of times. But here's the intent. So again, the committee reports, I would say top of the list, followed closely by the conference report, if there is one. Now, mind you, there won't always be a conference report. If there was no disagreement, if the House voted on the bill and the Senate just took the House's version and said, yeah, that's good, then there's no conference. Any question on conference report? Conference reports, by the way, as I said, are abbreviated. Typically, they're called House conference reports. Once in a while, they are called Senate conference reports. So H-Conf RPT. Sometimes you'll just see H-RPT conference. Sometimes you won't even see conference as part of the abbreviation, so you won't know it's a conference report until you start looking at it. Any questions? Okay. So remember, went through the House, got passed. Went through the Senate, got passed. If they disagreed, they went into a conference. If the conference agrees, they then have a final version to present to the president. And if the president signs his forehead, then we have a law, and he gets his little law badge. What the president does when the president signs the bill's forehead is the president also puts together what's called a presidential signing statement. And these are produced in something called, it's called the Daily Compilation of Presidential Documents, and it's found online. Again, don't worry about the resources, or the actual source. But turning to page 25, you'll see an example. Actually, you will see the signing statement in 1974. I think that was President Ford at the time. The president who signed ERISA into law. Now, one interesting footnote about presidential signing statements, again, I won't spend too much time. Back when President Bush, the second President Bush, George W. Bush, was president, he started inserting language in his signing statements referring to a unitary executive theory of government. This made huge news back in the day in mid-2000s, 2006, 8. This was basically a theory that was drafted and put together by a Justice Department lawyer back in the 70s named Samuel Alito, who working in the Justice Department, submitted this memo to his superiors and ultimately to President Reagan, suggesting, hey, there are all these lawyers looking at legislative intent and making these arguments and cases based on legislative intent. Why doesn't the executive have their say with regard to what legislative intent says? So the president gets some skin in the game, if you will, with regard to these legislative intent arguments. So then Justice Department lawyer Alito submitted this memo. President Reagan started inserting language in his signing statements. Later on, and I don't know exactly what happened in the interim between the 70s and the 2000s, President Bush started inserting this language, the unitary executive, that the executive had these particular privileges. So just to make some of this associate with real life. And so that is what a presidential signing statement might do. I don't think, given the controversy over this, President Obama has not done that. That's not to say that any future president would not. So of possible interest to keep one's ear open once we have a new president. Okay, so those are the documents. And of course, once the president signs the law, we have our public law with our all-important public law number. So let's turn to page 4. Wake up my computer here. So again, just to remind us some of the resources I've referred to. So here are the list of Congresses, remember in the 114th. So all of these documents are assigned the Congress number first, hyphen, and then whatever random number they're given. And that's true also of public laws. So remember, ERISA, as it originally was enacted, was 93-406. I don't expect you to remember the number, just understand what that number means. 93rd Congress, 406th public law. And actually, let's get past that. So the next suggestion I make, first and foremost, and today's goal is for you to understand that process and understand what these documents are, and hopefully understand when you're looking at abbreviation what document you're looking at. Next step is to get to know a couple of good sources. Again, don't expect you to remember, I can find this committee report from 1985 here and that conference report from 1972 there. I don't remember that. I certainly don't expect anybody else to. But know a couple of good sources where you can at least start to investigate. First source here is congress.gov. We've seen this when we were looking at public laws. So here in this as well as the U.S. Code. So here in this public laws link, congress.gov will give us the public laws, and everything is slow on the web today. So here we see the laws starting from where we are now, 114th, where we now have 2 public laws passed in the 114th Congress. Exciting. Here are the public laws that have been passed in the 114th, all 2 of them. In the 113th, so the last Congress, 2013 to 2014, there were 296. I can click on Show More, and then I get down to actually the 93rd Congress. So congress.gov is actually a decent place if you just need a quick and dirty, at least start on legislative history research. For these older public laws, so back in 1973 and 74, you're not going to find links to the full text, but at least you'll get references to the documents. So you get started in finding them, and then once you get references to the documents, if there isn't a full text link, if you don't know where else to go, that's when you ask somebody who does. If nothing else, you'll keep me employed. So back here in the 93rd Congress, I can sort this a bunch of different ways. Typically, what I like to do is either law ascending or descending. I'll go descending because I'm guessing 406 is toward the end. And I also want to increase my results per page. And as you can see, it's not the smoothest, but it's free. That's a biggie. And you can see 93, so here's the public law, 93,638, so that's a little high. So what I'm going to have to do is go back a little to find 93,406. I'm going to guess I have to go back a couple of screens. I guessed wrong. Rats. Bless you. It's moving a little anyway, so 93. Huh. So maybe it was on that first screen. So you can see, you sort of hunt and peck till you find your number. I've sorted it reverse. So there's 439, 421. We're getting there. 406. Okay, so basically this is not giving us a great deal of information. And as I said, when you click on, okay, I should go back. So what I'm clicking on here is the bill number. This is the bill that ultimately got passed. Clicking on this, law, you can't, I mean, honestly it makes sense to me to click on the word law, but they want you to click on the bill number. I don't want to click on the representative's name because I don't really want more information about that person. I want more information about the bill and what happened to it and that it ultimately became a public law. And it does give me some information. It gives me references to some committee reports. Now again, I'm going to have to go track these down because there are no links, but that gets me started. And we'll talk about other places to track some of these down. So that's essentially congress.gov. It's a little clunky and not very complete, but again, good for a quick and dirty. Another resource worth knowing about is ProQuest Congressional. This is kind of on the other end of the spectrum. ProQuest Congressional is a very, very, very expensive database. We subscribe to it here in the library because it's one of the best sources for legislative history research if you really need to dig into full legislative history research. And the reason it's the best, I mean, it does a lot of other things too. Actually, the undergraduate library subscribes to this too for the political science department because it does a lot of things. But for our purposes, what it does is it compiles a fairly comprehensive legislative history list of the documents. So whereas Congress.gov gave us a couple of committee reports and that's it, ProQuest Congressional is on the other end. It will give us just about everything. But just like we had to know that all-important public law number for Congress.gov, we need to know the all-important public law number to use ProQuest Congressional. So again, if we take a look at our example, ERISA, so 93, so I'm at public law number, I've clicked on that, and this is on your handouts, by the way. I'm sorry it came out so faint, but if you look really closely and carefully, you'll see I'm now doing exactly what's on page 27. So 93rd Congress, I leave it at PL because we have the all-important public law number, and then I type in 406 because that's the random number assigned, and then I will click on search. And if all goes well, and then sometimes you get these select accounts. So we're the law library, and I have to start over. Sorry about that, it just logged me out. So we get to do it again. So 93, 406, search. Yay, all went well. So here are the results for public law number 93406. A little bit confusing. What I suggest is remember two things. On the right here, you can go to legislative history, and you can go to House and Senate reports. If you just want to look at the reports, because that's the best source for legislative intent, you can click straight on this link, and you'll get a listing of the reports. I'm going to go to the legislative history because I'd like you to see what a full compiled legislative history looks like. And what it does is it brings you to the title, and so I have to click on it again. And again, web access has been slow. And here is a fully compiled legislative history. So it gives us some background of our public law, 93-406. It gives us a summary, some description, and then it goes into the debates. And again, remember, debates equals congressional record. So here are congressional record sites. Now, because this is so old, we do not have links to the congressional record online. You would have to find older congressional records elsewhere. So again, if you don't know where that is, ask somebody who does. You can go to the different types of documents more quickly rather than scrolling here. So if we wanted to go directly to reports, it jumps down to reports, and notice there are a whole bunch of reports. And again, there aren't direct links to the reports. So again, you'd have to ask someone if you needed to find these. And I'm actually going to show you where the ERISA reports are, but again, the big challenge with legislative history research is finding the documents, because they can be any number of places. There's no systematic way to find them. For instance, you'll find reports on Westlaw back to 1990 comprehensively, but prior to 1990, there'll only be reports that are reprinted in UScan. So it's all these random things that only librarians remember, if we're lucky, and do this all the time, basically. But here you see at least the reference to the reports. So for instance, when Justin and I were looking for reports for the tax legislation he was interested in, we went to ProQuest Congressional, and we got a listing of 4 or 5 reports that Justin could then go and take a look at, one place or another, and see what the section by section analysis was, to see what they said about the section he was interested in. And the information you want, by the way, is this House report number. See, here on ProQuest, they abbreviate RP. No T, no E, just RP. But again, you can kind of guess. So here's the House report. It's 298, and we have to figure out that it's 93rd Congress. That's the important information. If you actually click on this link brings you to an abstract of the report, where it gives you the number a little more sensibly. So if you don't remember how to figure it out from the first screen, just click on the link to the abstract, and it'll give it to you in a more straightforward fashion. Unfortunately, this link is just a link to this abstract page, but it gives you a summary. Not much of one, admittedly. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the legislative history list. Actually, I have to go back further. So we're in House Senate reports up here. Okay, so here's our legislative history list. So you notice there are the different bill versions. So again, depending how the bill was amended, at some point you will get references to hearings. Remember hearings, what happened in the committees, and if there are any committee prints, we talked a little bit about prints, or documents, those sort of funky, they would be listed here. So again, this is a nice list. It's not the greatest because it doesn't give you the links to the full text, I'm the first to admit. Lots of hearings. And then there are miscellaneous. What happens is the weekly compilation of presidential documents appears, I don't know why they call it this, miscellaneous other publications. You just have to, if there is a presidential signing statement, it'll be here at the bottom under miscellaneous. So that's ProQuest. Again, worth getting to know at least while you're here if you need to do legislative history research. As alums, you're welcome to come back and use ProQuest anytime. I don't know where you go to work that many of you will encounter ProQuest because it is just ridiculously expensive. The huge Manhattan firms might have it, but that's probably, for instance, any of you going to work for courts, I don't think they would subscribe to ProQuest. And on page 27, again, I'm sorry for the faint copy, but you can kind of see how I filled it in and on page 28 what it looks like to click on the legislative history link in order to get the full list, or obviously the reports if all you want are reports. And that's on page 27A. Now the plan is, and it just works out this way, I realize it's not ideal, I'm giving you the concepts today, and then next time on Thursday we will do a workshop, so you will get your hands on these databases and actually some books. Not ideal because it'd be better to do it today when hopefully it's fresh in your mind, but this will also be good in kind of a way because it'll have sunk in and maybe leaked out a little, so you'll have a good refresher. So try to look in the glass half full approach. One of the places I will ask you to look is USCAN. Remember USCAN, we looked at one place to find the public laws. USCAN was U.S. Code Congressional Administrative News, which I don't expect anybody to remember. It looked like this. You probably won't use USCAN as, at least in print, as a resource. I'm showing it to you because USCAN is a good place to get your hands on the print reports. And I want you to, next time I'm going to ask you to find a report and find the section by section analysis of the report, because since that's the most important part of legislative history intent, you should get your hands on it and see how you find it. Again, finding a particular report and then flipping through it, you can do in any number of ways. So that's really why I'm showing you USCAN just briefly today, and then you'll be using it next time in our workshop. So again, USCAN comes in two parts. Each year can have multiple volumes. Each year the volume number starts with 1 and goes to 4, 5, or 6, depending on how much there is. And the first part are the laws volume. I'm going to pass this around. We saw this, and you see it on page 28, volume 1, laws. And on the spine you'll see volume 1, laws. This is 1994, that's 74, same concept applies. I'll start on this side of the room. You guys had the others. That's where you find the public laws. Turning to page 29. We've already seen this. In fact, this page actually came out of our statutes handout, and I just put it in here again. So on page 29, notice up top, it refers us for legislative history of acts, see page 4639. So for whatever year you're in, if you see that reference, you can just go to that page number, probably in a different volume, but it's paginated consecutively. And then what you see is what we've seen a whole bunch of times now, Public Law 93-406, with the table of contents with the sections. What we also saw when we were talking about statutes on page 30 is when we got into the text of the public law. The section 1 was just the short title, this act shall be called ERISA, and section 2 is the findings and declaration of policy. A lot of statutes, both federal and state, will often, not always, but often have a section, usually in the beginning, of why are they bothering passing this legislation? What do they have in mind? This is also good for legislative intent. I mean, Congress is actually saying, why do we care? This is why we care about this particular issue, and this is what we're hoping to do about it. Now, they state it in very general terms. So this is probably more useful if you're making a policy argument. Hey, look, Congress wanted to provide protections for employees for pension and health care. Obviously paraphrasing rather broadly. But reading this section, Congress finds that the growth in scope and numbers, so you can say, hey, this language should be interpreted this way because in the findings and declaration of policy section, Congress said that's what they wanted to do. So look at this section. It may not help you, but definitely look at the section. And again, this section sometimes will be found in statutes, not always, but both for federal and state. Okay, so public law, that's the first part of USCAN. That's generally in the volumes 1, 2 of whatever year. The second part of USCAN is the legislative history. Remember we saw that legislative history reference, page 4639? Well, that's in the later volumes of whatever year you're looking at. So here I have volume 3. And what I see here on the spine and what you is the word laws, so that means there are more public laws, but down here at the bottom, unfortunately, it's covered by our label. Sorry about that, that happens in a lot of libraries. I can see the words legislative history. So this tells me this is where I might find some of the legislative history for the public laws for that year. And again, it's organized by all-important public law number. So you need your public law number. But turning in the legislative history volumes to Public Law 93-406, and you'll see that on page 32. And I'll pass this around. Here's where you see the legislative history portion in UScan. Again, I don't expect that you'll find these volumes in very many places where you're working. You can always come to the library here and look at them. You'll actually find UScan on Westlaw. We'll be looking at that in the next class or two. But here's what it looks like in print, and essentially what it looks like on Westlaw. What UScan does is it gives us a listing. It's not comprehensive. Notice we're not finding all those hearings. We're not finding all those bazillion references to the congressional record. In fact, all we get for the congressional record are the dates of consideration. So we don't get any of the congressional record pages, just the dates. And it gives us lists a couple of reports, House reports, a couple of Senate reports. Again, I'm on page 32, it lists the House conference. In this case, there are actually two conference reports. There's a House conference and a Senate conference report. And then at the bottom, it tells us, and this is why we're interested in UScan today in next class, House and Senate reports and the House conference report are set out. So here you can find it in print. So again, next time I'm going to ask you to find a House report or a report, it could be a Senate report, in print, and then take a look at it. And you'll see, here's the beginning of the House report on page 32 that's set out in UScan. And if you were to flip a couple of the pages, you would find the section-by-section analysis. Actually, we did that earlier in the handout.
Is that what that means, set out? It means it's found in print?
Yeah, it's found right after,
Within?
right next.
Oh,
For-
all right.
And just following, not finding the right words. It's set out below. Really, if they'd added the word below, it would have been clear. Okay, so that's UScan. As I said, probably you won't use it all that frequently, especially in print, but we'll be using it next time so you can see the House report. Okay, we have a little bit of time to review how to find that all-important public law number. Hopefully, this is really a review, and if you're really bored by this, I'm happy, because that means you've done it, you understand it. Couple of different ways. First and foremost, most of the time, you will be looking for the legislative intent of a particular code section, whether it's federal or state. So you all remember how to find the session law, at least you all remember how to find the session law right from the code. Can anybody, I know this is abstract, so. Okay. For the all-important public law number, that's going to be federal. Remember, public law is the federal name for session laws. Chapter law is the New York name for session laws. So for federal, you have the code section. Remember, you have the code section. You want to find what the legislative intent is for a particular language of your code section. So looking at the United States Code Annotated, and if Westlaw hasn't logged me out, we'll go back into Westlaw, and turning to from page 33 to 34, our favorite section, 29, USCA 1144. And again, this works in USCS, this works in McKinney's, this works in New York CLS. Turning to page 35, after the section, you see in print, I call it the parenthetical, because I can't come up with a better name and it's in parentheses. Remember that list of public laws. We've looked at this a bunch of times. Hopefully it looks familiar. And so going through, we see the first public law is good old 93-406. Everybody see that? If I go here on Westlaw, Westlaw calls it credits. Lexis calls it history. So again, we see public law 93-406. And then we see the subsequent public laws that amended our section, 29 USC 1144. Okay, what we haven't talked about yet is what comes next, historical and statutory notes. What this tells us, and you'll find, I'll show you it on Westlaw in a moment, there are a whole lot of public laws that amend this, right? You don't know, whatever language you're interested in, you don't actually know which public law created that language. Maybe it was 93-406 because ERISA got started then, but maybe it got added later, or it was originally something different and one of these later public laws changed it. There are like, what, a couple dozen in here? So you don't want to have to do this legislative research for 12 or 15 different public laws, right? That would take a very long time and get very tedious. So using the historical and statutory notes and reading these little blurbs, it will tell you, as I say on the handout, which section each amendment affected. So here's the 1974 acts. It gives you references to the reports. The 1983 acts, let's actually turn and find to page 36, where you see the words references in text about halfway down in the left-hand column. It tells you this subchapter referred in subsections, and it gives you all the subsections of our section. Originally read this title, which principally enacted the subchapter. So it's basically telling you here what language got changed. And then you can see on the right-hand side, amendments, 2006 amendments, subsection E, public law, added subsection E. So that's where subsection E came from, was actually 2006. So if I'm interested in subsection E, I now can go straight to 2006 public law. I don't have to bother with 93-406 or any of the others. And going through, you see the detail. It requires some close reading, but it can be very useful, especially with a section like 1144 that has a whole lot of amendments that you really don't want to have to research every single one if you don't have to. And again, in print, I included the pocket part on the principle of update, update, and update, although there are really no changes in the pocket part, so there was nothing there that was useful. So in history, never quite sure where they got this name from, editors and revisers notes. So here we see basically they took this right out of the book, references in text, originally read, and so here are the amendments. And so here we find out subsection E, just what we were talking about. So on Westlaw, you go to history, and you go to this editors and revisers notes. I'll show you, we're almost out of time. I will show you on Lexis next time. Bloomberg isn't quite complete yet, but we'll see what Bloomberg has to show us next time as well. So that's the most important, that's really the way you will find a public law number for legislative history research when you're interested in a particular code section, which in my view is what you're doing most of the time if you're doing legislative history research. So that's really what you want to remember. There are these other ways we'll review next time. We've already seen the popular name table. If you don't have the code section, you have the name of the act, Civil Rights Act of 1964, ERISA, and you don't know the code section yet. And of course the translation table to translate between public law section numbers and code section numbers. That's a whole lot. Again, if you understand the executive summary, what these documents are, bill, hearings, report, congressional record equals debates, conference report, public law. You understand what those are, have a sense of what the abbreviations are, you're 3/4 the way there. Any questions? You might want to bring this handout next time, although I have put it up on our handout, on the handouts link. Likewise this one, although probably less necessary. As I said, next time we'll take a look at what this looks like online, more fully on Westlaw, on Lexis, and then we will do our workshop, which will actually happen up in the library so we can take a look at UScan. Any questions? See you on Thursday.